Hey guys, sorry this is so late. I had some pretty massive computer problems, but I think they're fixed, so let's get right to it, shall we? So the Constitution says that the president is in charge of enforcing the laws, but it doesn't really say how he goes about doing that. Obviously, he can't do it all by himself. He needs to hire a bunch of people. The Constitution doesn't really say what that looks like, so the president gets to decide how that looks like. And pretty much Washington got to figure it out, and the rest of the presidents followed in his footsteps. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, suggested that Washington have four different groups of people underneath him in charge of different things. He called these groups departments. Each one of them has a head called a secretary. And let's see who those first four secretaries were. We have this group that meets that's composed of all the secretaries, the heads of the departments. They were called his cabinet, which is French for small room. It's where the king goes to discuss with his advisors in a small room. We have the State Department. That is going to be in charge of all foreign affairs, meaning all like ambassadors and dealing with other nations. Very important. And he picked Thomas Jefferson, right over here, to be the head of the State Department. Today, the Secretary of State is probably the second most important person in the executive department. It was President, Secretary of State. Vice President is like number 23. Not an important job at all, actually. Then, of course, you need a group of people in charge of the military, and that was called the War Department. And today it's called the Department of Defense. And he chose Henry Knox to be the Secretary of War. Then you need someone to be in charge of the money, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. I'm going to talk about him a lot in just 1 minute. And then the Justice Department. So when let's say you break someone's window, let's say you're playing baseball and your baseball goes through someone's window, they could sue you and to get their money back for replacing the window. So you go to court and it's them accusing you, and it's you versus them. But when you break a law of the United States, it is the United States accusing you of breaking the law, a criminal law. So you break a window, that's a civil case where you have to pay money, but you're not going to go to jail for accidentally breaking someone's window, right? It's not a criminal case, it's a civil case where you just got to pay money to fix it. In a criminal case, you break the law, it is the government in charge of accusing you. So that would be the president's job of doing that, and the people he hires, they're called attorney generals or district attorney generals, and they answer to the Justice Department. And Edmund Randolph was the first attorney general. He's the secretary of the Justice Department. Just these four. Today we have like 16 different departments, I think. We have the Department of the Interior. We have the Department of Homeland Security. We got a lot more departments than back then. Also included in cabinet meetings, but not considered a department head, was the head of the post office, the postmaster general, by the name of Samuel Osgood. Washington tried to be neutral in a lot of political ideas. He wanted to combine and unite the people. He didn't want to be too divisive, especially in the very beginning of a nation's history. But Hamilton and Jefferson are going to advise the president in very opposite ways. I'm sure you know a little bit about Alexander Hamilton already. He was very Federalist. In fact, he wrote the Federalist Papers. He was very much in favor of this new government, and he loved having a very strong central government. He thought that we needed a strong central government for it to be able to do its job effectively. He was also very pro-city. He's a city boy. He thinks that cities are where America will grow the most and be the strongest. The nation with the biggest cities will be the most powerful. And that is very true. He had a vision for America to be very urban, very industrial, big factories. And that's where all the jobs would be. And that's where all of the military, the guns and the battleships and things would be made in big cities. He was very pro big city, big machine. He also thought that America would do best if our economy was very diverse, meaning lots of different people having lots of different jobs. He did not want everyone to have the same job. If you're a cotton farmer in the South, and so many Southerners were cotton farmers, hey, if it's a good year for cotton, you're rich. But if it's a bad year for cotton, everyone in the state is poor. And if everyone in the state loses money at the same time, that's just going to throw the entire economy into a tailspin, and it's going to be terrible. On the other hand, if it's a bad year for cotton, but only 5% of you are cotton farmers, the rest of the economy will be able to take care of you and will continue to go on strong. It's not good to have a single type of economy. Diversify. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, he was an anti-federalist. He wanted a very weak central government. He was all about states' rights and state power. In fact, he even wrote a pamphlet one day saying if the states do not like what the federal government does, they could just ignore it, which I don't agree with. He was a farm boy, and he thought farming was where it's at. He thought that America ought to be a farming nation, very agricultural, very rural, living in small towns and villages, not in big cities. He did not believe this for an economic reason, but for a moral reason. He thought that people living in cities would be more prone to greed and to all sorts of sinful behaviors that, of course, we country folk would never do. There's no giant bars, out in the middle of the countryside. I don't think it's cities that make people sinful, though. I think it's quite possible to be sinful on a farm. It's just as easy to sit on a farm as it is in a city apartment. But that's his point of view. America was really, really poor at the time. We had just fought this war. They offered George Washington 25 grand a year. That is not very much today, but back then that was a lot of money. He refused to take a penny for his salary. He only asked that America pay his expenses, whatever he spends on the job, that they would reimburse him for that. Rather generous of him, but he racked up some big bills. He threw some big parties for people and spent a lot of money on alcohol and food for his friends. And America did end up paying a lot of money for that. $25,000 a year would have been 2% of the national budget. And he said, America has so little money, please don't spend it all on me. America has better things to pay for. In comparison, 2% of today's government's budget is $58 billion. That's how much we spend on all the public schools across America. $58 billion. Imagine if they paid modern presidents that much. They do not. They pay modern presidents about $400,000 a year, which is still a lot, but it's not 2% of the budget. $58 billion, my goodness. We spend 3 times that amount of money on just the interest on the national debt alone, not even paying the debt, but paying the interest. That's a lot of dough. After 8 years of service, he had spent $450,000. That was more than $50,000 a year. So maybe he should have just taken the salary and paid for his parties himself rather than asking the government to pay for all his parties. That's crazy. Congressmen at the time made $6 a day, which was a lot of money. A lot of other people were making $1 a day. Cabinet makers, cabinet members, the secretary of state. They made about $3,500 a year, which was about double what Congress made. The government could not afford to pay those salaries. They set the salaries, but didn't have any cash to pay them. They also owe a lot of money to other nations that we borrowed money from for the revolution, and we can't afford to pay that. And there's still plenty of soldiers that we haven't paid for. And it's now been like 8 years since the revolution, and we still haven't paid some of these soldiers. That's not cool. So Hamilton is in charge of the Treasury, and he is in charge of trying to figure a way out of this debt. And he says, number one, we need to tax people. The only way the government makes money is by taxing. So we need to start taxing. They were selling Western lands, and that made a little money. Not enough. They were taxing imports, and that made some money. Not enough. And then they had been charging for services like selling a driver's license today, but that wasn't nearly enough money. It says, as to taxes, they are evidently inseparable from government. It is impossible without them to pay the debts of the nation, to protect it from foreign danger, or to secure individuals from lawless violence and rapine. It is impossible for the government to protect you without money. It's going to spend that money on police officers, on judges and lawyers to keep you safe, on soldiers to keep you safe. Uh, the government needs money to work. Number two, we need to pay our debts. So a lot of people said, okay, the Second Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation, they made deals with people. They promised to pay soldiers X amount of money. They took loans. We didn't do that. This is a new government. Let's just pretend we don't have to pay what we promised, because it wasn't us. It was the last guys. It'd be like if, I don't know, if Pastor John had made a deal and then, he goes off to his other job and then I come in the job and I say deal's off. Wouldn't be a very good thing, especially if you have a signed contract. What if America's very first act was to not pay our debts? I don't think that would make a lot of people happy with us. So he said, we got to pay our debts. Technically, we are a brand new government, but we got to pay those debts. Many people had bought government bonds. A government bond is buying, basically giving a loan to the government. So you give the government $100, and they say in 20 years we'll give you $110. So it's a guaranteed 10% interest or whatever. Well, when it looked like the government couldn't repay them, a lot of people were selling those government bonds for pennies. So you pay $100 and you get a piece of paper that says the government promises to pay you $110, but the government's broke. So you go to your neighbor and say, hey, want to buy this for $1? They say, yeah, sure. So some people had given the government hundreds of dollars and had only gotten $1 or $2 back on their investment. Other people had spent a few dollars on these pieces of paper. And now when the government says we promise we'll pay back all those papers, some of those people are making a lot of money. And some of those people lost a lot of money. And of course, the people who won the money are like, yes, that was an awesome risk. I took a big risk, but I'm getting a big reward. Other people got really mad. These people who buy up seemingly worthless things, hoping that they'll make money, they're called speculators. Speculation means questioning or, well, it means questioning. So there's this question of whether or not the government will be able to repay those pieces of paper. And, well, now it looks like they will. Now that the government's repaying them, the speculators do make a fortune. Sometimes speculators lose everything, though. What if the government decided not to pay those? Every penny they spend on that would be worthless. So you win some, you lose some. A lot of people said, should we reward those speculators for their, I don't know, for their sneakiness, promising to pay $1 or $2 for what's worth $110? But Hamilton said, hey, they didn't force anyone to sell their bonds. If people made a foolish decision selling their bonds, that's their fault. Number three, the central government must pay off the state's debts as well. This is called assumption. We're taking on the state's debts upon ourselves because now only the central government's allowed to make loan or take out loans and things. So we need to say all state debt is now central government debt, and we need to pay that off. And here's a letter from the Treasury Department. This is from Alexander Hamilton. January 9, 1790, the Secretary of Treasury, in obedience to the resolution of the House of Representatives on the 21st day of September last, has during the recess of Congress applied himself to the confederation of a proper plan for the support of the public credit, blah, blah, blah. He is just saying, hi, I'm Alexander Hamilton, I'm in charge, and here's my plan for fixing our finances. One reason Hamilton said we have to do this is because, remember, a lot of states did not appreciate giving up some of their power to the central government. The new government is much stronger than some of the states think it ought to be. So I said, hey, if we pay off all their debt, then they won't be mad at us anymore. There was a problem, though. Some states had already spent all their money repaying all the loans. Other states hadn't started repaying their loans. So now some states are saying, wait, I repaid off all my loans, and now I have to help I think like Massachusetts repay its loans as well. That's not fair. Hamilton said, too bad. We're all in this together. We are all one nation now. We're not 13 different nations. We're one nation. We all got to help each other with our loans. And number four, he said, we need to establish a national bank. So when we tax everyone, where does the tax money go? And when we write out paychecks, where does that come from? We need a bank to deposit it. I said it really wouldn't be fair if we just chose one bank And besides, back then, banks usually didn't have many branches. Your bank would probably only have one building. Like today, I have First National Bank of Maine, and I know there's like 4 or 5 branches within driving distance of here, and I can go into any one of those buildings. Um, they needed a bank that would be open in all 13 states, and I don't think there were any national banks like that. So here's one bank that will work in every single state. All tax money would be deposited there. Anytime they're paying anyone, a congressman, a soldier, the president, paying for roads and bridges, it's all coming out of the national bank account. The bank, even though it's created by the government, regular old people would own it. So the government is just basically telling people they need to start a bank, and then people invest and make their own bank. And it's somewhat controlled by the government, but on the day-to-day basis, it is owned and operated by normal civilians. The government would buy 1/5 of the shares of the bank, 20%. So the government would have 20% control and no more than that. Jefferson is going to be like the opposite of Hamilton in every way conceivable. He really disliked having DC paying for states' debts because some states had already paid their debts, like Virginia, and he's from Virginia. Other states had not. He also felt a national bank would be very helpful for northern businesses, but it wouldn't be very helpful for southern farmers. Farmers don't use a lot of cash, they just trade. And when they do use cash, they don't really use banks very often. On the other hand, big businesses like northern businesses need banks all the time. So if the government created a bank, it would be expensive and it would help the North and not help the South. So it's going to help Alexander Hamilton's state of New York, and it's not going to help his own state of Virginia. To compromise, no one was there in the room where it happened, so no one exactly knows how this compromise was made. That song is about this compromise. Jefferson said, I'll go along with your national bank if you put the capital in the South. There was no permanent national capital yet. They had been in Philadelphia for a little while. They had been in New York City for a little while. They said, let's put the capital in the South. Back then, when transportation and travel is so slow, it's not like today where if you live in Virginia, you can drive up to New York City or fly up to New York City for the weekend and then come back down again. Back then, from Virginia to New York City would be a week-long trip maybe. So having a capital in the South would be really, really important. It would bring a lot of people to the South. It would bring a lot of economy to the South because there's going to be a lot of important people who move to the nation's capital, and the nation's capital would become a very, very large city. And if that's in the South, it's going to be a large city benefiting the Southerners. They hoped that it would become a very large city, and it would be a trade center, an educational center, and a cultural center. It would really be the bedrock of America. And DC really has become that. It's not the biggest city in America, but it is one of the biggest cities in America. It has huge ports, and there's lots of container and cargo ships going in and out all the time. So trade, check. Education, there are plenty of universities in and around DC. Check. Culture. DC is filled with amazing things to do that are full of what some people call Americana, patriotic culture. So the Smithsonian museums, you can go there and for free go to some of the best museums in the world. And they're in our nation's capital. People travel from around the world to visit the Smithsonian museums because they're so amazing. I've been there multiple times, and I'm hoping to bring the seniors there this spring. They are really fantastic, and they're free because they're paid for by tax dollars. The Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the MLK Jr. Memorial, all these monuments and memorials, the reflecting pool, they're all in D.C. The Vietnam Memorial, remember what that is, the black shiny rock in the little valley with all the plaques of everyone's names who died in Vietnam. World War II and the Iwo Jima memorials, really cool stuff there, lots of very interesting statues. The museums, there's all sorts of art museums. The Met Gala, is that New York City actually? I don't know. Lots of really cool stuff in DC, and people do go there as a tourist destination, just like Jefferson hoped. Washington, D.C. was given its own land as a compromise. D.C. is not part of any state. They said, let's carve out a piece of America that's not part of any state for our capital. So our capital is its own area, and it is not giving any favoritism to any one state. So they carved out a little chunk of land, very small chunk of land, between Virginia and Maryland, and called that the District of Columbia. It's not the state of Columbia. It's not the state of Virginia either. It's the District of Columbia. George Washington tried to be neutral in a lot of political ideas. He really hated the idea of political parties, like we have today, Democrat and Republican. He thought that that would just create a lot of conflict instead of people working together. He says the common mischiefs of the spirit of party politics, are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. We should have no parties in America. Hamilton and Jefferson, though, two very important leaders of Washington's cabinet, they had very different ideas for what government ought to look like. And then, of course, most other people said either I agree with Hamilton or I agree with Jefferson. So the nation just kind of split into two. Some people liked Hamilton's ideas, some people liked Jefferson's ideas. Hamilton's group was named the Federalist Party. Jefferson's is called the Democratic Republicans. Today, the Federalist Party isn't around anymore, and the Democratic Republicans have kind of morphed into today's Democrats, although there's been so many different types of politics along the way. What Jefferson is arguing for and against has nothing to do with what anyone today is arguing for or against. Completely different issues from a different time. All right, let's get into some of the problems that our early government had. We had all the financial problems first, and then we had the party politics of Hamilton and Jefferson. Now we come to the Whiskey Rebellion. So there was a new tax on whiskey. On the frontier, a lot of corn farmers couldn't get their corn to market before it rotted, so they would distill it into whiskey. And because there was hardly any cash, barrels of whiskey were used as money. So taxing it was very hurtful to these people. If you refused to pay your taxes, you'd have to go to court to explain why. Well, the nearest court was hundreds of miles away. So it's not like here in Wisconsin, if you have to go to court, it's just down the street. Not a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal that you're going to court, but it's not like it's a week-long journey just to get there. People are busy. They don't want to go 100 miles to the nearest courthouse. So a group of angry farmers said, hey, last time we didn't like taxes, we had a revolution against England. So this time when we don't like taxes, what should we do? Let's have another revolution. And Washington said, no, we cannot shoot each other the first time we dislike what the government does. You have to obey the government, and if you don't like the new law, you have to vote against it, not shoot them. So Washington ordered the governor of Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion. The governor of Pennsylvania was, I guess, on board with the rebellion or sympathetic, and he said, no, I'm not going to put him down. He offered pardon to whoever went home would not get in any trouble whatsoever, but they wouldn't go home. So Washington got 13,000 soldiers and led them into battle himself personally. This is the only time that a sitting president has led troops into battle. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but usually how that works is he sits in the Oval Office and tells troops what to do. He doesn't go himself. The American forces show up, and the farmers don't want to shoot at American soldiers, so they all go home. No one died, but the government said, hey, you don't get to rebel every time you don't like the government. I mean, imagine if every modern American started a revolution every time the government did something we didn't like. There would be a lot of revolutions, and that's no way to live. It's happening in the Supreme Court. The Constitution says that there will be a Supreme Court with 5 associate justices and 1 chief justice, and that's this guy, John Jay. Congress was allowed to set up lesser courts, less important courts underneath them, and they decided to make 1 federal court for every state, so 13 district courts, and then 3 circuit courts. It's called that because each Supreme Court justice would visit different cities in a circle, or circuit, and hear court cases wherever they went. After much arguing, Congress passed 12 amendments. The states only ratified 10, and that became the basis of our Bill of Rights. That was easy. Congress hoped that we would go out west slowly but steadily and surely, but people started rushing to the frontier the minute they were allowed to. The American government made a lot of treaties with different Native American groups. We kept some of them, but most of them were broken. Some of them were broken by us, some of them were broken by them. I dare say the vast majority of the times the American government made a promise, it did not keep it. The British kept on telling those Indians to attack us, and it was not hard for them to persuade the Indians to attack us because, honestly, the American government treated the Indians really, really terribly, and it is shameful how many treaties we broke. We're not keeping our word. Not cool. In 1794, remember Mad Anthony Wayne? We didn't talk about Mad Anthony Wayne, did we? So in the Revolution, he was greatly outnumbered, and he was told to go attack a British fort, and he was outnumbered like 3-1. So it's like, yeah, we can get him. So they ran out of bullets after like the first shot, and did they retreat? No, no, they ran forward, and I have no idea how, but he won the fort. Everyone called him mad, meaning crazy, not angry. He's just crazy, dude. Um, but apparently just crazy enough to win. So this guy, after the revolution, he's sent out west to go fight some Indians, and he fights the Battle of Fallen Timbers near modern-day Toledo, Ohio. The Indians tried to retreat to a British fort because the British said, if you fight, the Americans will help you. But when the Indians come running for help to the British close their doors and say, sorry, you're all going to die when the Americans catch you. So not cool of them either. Thankfully, this was a very small battle, only about 30 to 40 dead on each side. It's not like a massacre. But the American soldiers, after the battle, did go to their village, burnt down their houses, destroyed their crops, and so these people don't have anywhere to live anymore. And in a peace treaty, the Indians decided to give us about half of Ohio, and we would give them some money and some junk in return. And when I say junk, I literally mean junk. Not very much money and not very much junk, and we get half of Ohio. Joseph Brant, he's in your book in the last chapter. He fought for the British in the American Revolution. He was a Christian who believed in freedom, and he didn't believe that the Americans would give him freedom, and he thought the British would give him freedom. So, interesting story, complicated story. He came to America and tried to make a peace treaty with a fair compromise. But America said, no, we don't want to compromise. We want to shoot all your people and take all your stuff. And the Indians that he was trying to lead into a compromise said, we don't want to compromise. We want to scalp the Americans and take all their stuff. So one leader trying to make peace on both sides and help everyone to get along, and neither side wants peace. They just want to kill each other. Not cool. In the first few years of Washington's rule, 3 new states joined: Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee.